Let's take a look through the camera and actually see how this plays. So from here we can press play and we don't see a lot of the hues at first. And then we should see it disappear. So at this point we could actually stop there, but let's just add one extra detail, which will be the kind of a tune tractor beam. And then also we can add a little polish. So with the grease pencil selected, I'm going to press the period key in the outliner there just to see our UFO grease collection. And I'm going to go Shift S and snap the cursor to the selected. In fact, let's bring our overlays back on so we can see this a little bit better. Actually, I'm not sure we have got the UFO properly selected. That's better. And then go Shift S and then cursor to selected. And now let's go Shift A and add in another grease pencil blank object. Now I'm just going to make sure this one is slightly behind the other one by just pressing G from this angle and just moving it about there. And then I'm going to go Control Tab and jump into the draw mode. From there, I'm going to come over and just set this up. So we need a new layer, which is going to be our beam, and we need a new material, which is going to be our beam, or rather the beam material. Let's change the color of this to be quite bright and kind of in the blues, as our tractor beam is here. Although I'm actually going to set the alpha down a little bit. Let's take this down to something like 0.2. I'm going to press F to scale this up in the view, and drawing into the scene should work quite nicely. But we can see we're actually clipping through. So what I want to do is come over to the Layers tab and I want to set the strokes to be in 3D. Now we can see that that isn't showing through our spaceship. All right, so this I'm going to name UFO Beam. And then let's put grease at the end again. Now what I'd like to do is have the beam as a child of the UFO grease pencils. So I'm just going to left click and drag that on top, but hold Shift to convert that into a child. And there we can see the UFO beam object underneath now. So if we were to draw in a little something, and then go back to the object mode. When this one is moving around, we should be able to see that beam coming around. It's easier to see in this viewport for the moment. So with that, I'm going to undo that stroke and lay down a few more strokes. So I'm going to hold Shift and draw in a few approximate beams here. In fact, I think I still want this slightly bigger, something like this. I'm just going to slightly overlap them as I'm holding Shift and drawing down. And I'm just adding as many strokes as I can until this is all nicely filled like this. And let's turn off the other UFO at this point. Let's just uncheck that, and that's looking pretty dark on this side of things. So what I'd like to do is go into object mode, and we have this layer here set to actually use the lights. So we could uncheck that if we want, and we could also set this to add. So it's going to add onto the background there. But if we set this to use lights, we can get a pretty nice effect by adding in a little point light and just bringing that down a little bit, maybe turning up the strength. I'm going to push this into the blues as well. So it shouldn't really affect the surround very much, but if we just add this in front of the lines that we've drawn there and jump back into the camera view, we can also come over and come to our material and increase the alpha to kind of make this more intense as well. We can kind of see that the lower half of it is a little bit imprecise. It's not hugely noticeable, but maybe we could do with a little bit of a hotspot. So I'm going to add in another layer here and call this the hotspot. Set this to actually be a fill material. I'm going to take this all the way up to the white, and then we just need to make sure we're in draw mode. And then if we left click and drag in the view there, we've created our hotspot. That's drawing behind here actually. So I'm going to undo that and come over to the layers and create a new layer and put this on top called the hotspot. Uncheck use lights on this one. We're going to click add on this one. So this one's enabled. Now we can jump over to our hotspot, and here I'm going to come over to the circle tool and alt left click something into the viewport there, which is actually kind of tricky to do from this particular viewport. I'm going to try and use this viewport to actually lay this in. So alt and left click. And the reason we're struggling to see this is because we're set to use 3D position for our layers. If we find the stroke section, we're on 3D location. And so if we take a look at our stroke, the circle that we've just laid down is within those other layers. So we're going to tab into edit mode. Let's just make sure we can see it by pressing Shift Alt Z. And then if I press L to select these, we can move these forward. But I'm going to do this kind of off to the side here. So I'm just going to move that so it's ahead of all the others, and then jump back into the camera and just reposition it to taste. All right, so let's come over to the material again. I'm going to push this again into the blues. I'm going to come back over to the beam and set this a little bit lower again. And I think that should actually do. Let me just hide the hotspot for a second and just take a look at these lines here. What I'd like to do is be able to control, or rather basically mask out the tips, the ends of a lot of these strokes, just so that it's a nice cleaner arc. So to do that, I'm going to create another material. and I'm going to call this mask matte. I'm going to make this a fill material, and I'm going to come over to the layers, and I'm going to add a new layer for this, and I'm going to call this mask. Now we should be able to see us draw something in the viewport. So we're set to draw right now. Right click. We're on the mask layer, we've got the mask material, and we're set to use the circle tool. So I'm going to go shift space and switch that to just regular draw. And I'm going to draw around the area that I want to keep. So I'm going to do an arcing sweep over here and then take it up and around the top, and that's fine. So let's take a look at that in solid shading and even in wireframe. And we can see the actual stroke that's just been drawn there, as it was a little bit tricky to see what was going on in rendered mode as we drew behind that. But we can adjust this if we want, or we could try drawing it again after we've set it up. So for example, let's take our beam and we want to use masks on this layer now, and we're going to add in the mask layer. Now we can see that's being cut off neatly there. With that done, I'm going to remove the mask from the viewport by just dropping the opacity. We can kind of see a distinct lighting of the area where the mask is though, but this will go away once we move back into object mode and deselect with Alt-A. Let's turn our hotspot back on because we should see a little problem with this. And you can see that this is getting clipped out here as well. So what I'm going to do is put that on its own layer. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on there. We've got the hotspot selected already, so I'm just going to press the M key for move and then move that to a new layer. Let's come over to the layers tab and we'll rename that to hotspot. I'll keep that to use lights, but I'm going to set this to add and then tab back into the object mode there. And I think this one particular frame is okay. Let's switch this graph editor over to a dope sheet, and then we'll switch this to show us the grease pencil stuff, and then jump into draw mode. With the UFO beam object, we've got this set at frame 92, so I'm just going to drag that to the start, and I'm going to select the UFO grease object just to check that lines up. So I'm just going to drag this one frame back. All right, so this is how things are looking just at the moment. All right, so we'll clean that up a little bit in a moment, but let's give this a little bit more interest in the beam itself. So we're going to make sure we have the point light selected, and we can control click on the UFO beam so that we can then take those two things into the local view. All right, so with object mode, I'm going to make sure we've got the beam selected, and then we can go into the effects. An effect I'd like to add to this is a little bit of wave distortion. It's already set vertically, so that's the sort of thing I'd like. And then I'd just like to be able to animate this phase as if something's being sucked back into the ship. But first we can refine the size and strength of the wave flowing through our tractor beam here though. And I think that's pretty cool. So here again, we can type in something like hashtag frame and then press play to see that, and that's looking pretty good. It's going the wrong way though, or at least maybe it doesn't even matter that way, but what we can just simply do is times that by -1 and that should invert it. So now it's going sucking things back into the ship. Another effect we might like to add is the glow effect. And left click and drag across the size and make that a lot larger. So we're getting a lot more glow, somewhere around 200. We can see these little banding lines here, which I think actually are quite a good effect, but we can keep that under control by just changing the amount of samples. So I've doubled it there, but I was actually quite happy with those default 8. Another thing I'd like to add to this is to come over to the modifiers and give it some noise. Let's see what this looks like already. We can see actually it's providing a little bit of randomization to the points on our beam there, which look pretty cool, but I'm just going to crank these things up. So crank the strength up, crank the thickness up, and now take a look at that. And we can see it's actually affecting the hotspot quite a lot. So let's take a look at the influence and just give it to the beam itself. That way it shouldn't affect the hotspot. Let's try playing with the noise scale a little bit. So you can see it's getting really crazy, but for us, we're going to need to keep this pretty low. And by animating the noise offset, we could get some nice effects there as well. Taking a look at the randomize section, we can see it's doing something every 4 frames. I'm going to turn this down to 1, and now we should get a little something different on every frame. And with that, I'm going to hit slash on the numpad again to bring us back into the main scene. And just to see this a little clearer, let's turn off the overlays and scan through that. That's looking pretty interesting. All right, what I think I would like to do at this point is glow some of the lights on the ship itself. So I'm going to select that, come over to our layers. So we have our lights here on a separate layer. And to be able to glow we're going to need to come over to our effects. Now our effects, if we switch on glow, we do have a threshold which should allow us to just glow the lights themselves, but that does mean making sure that none of the other colors on the ship happen to be as bright. I don't mind these being included. Otherwise, we would need to separate these out into another object because we can't actually filter in the same way that we did with some of the other effects by just telling it to use a particular layer or material. The hotspot down here, maybe this needs to be a lot more blurred. So if we come to select, let's put the overlays back on. So we've got the UFO beam. Again, I think if we were to come over to our effects and add a blur to this, we can't get access to limit this just to one layer. So I'm going to remove that for a second, tab into edit mode, and with this press the P key to separate the selected points. And once we do that, this has now been added into our scene as another object, UFO beam grease.001. I'm actually just going to call that, let's see, UFO hotspot. Now what we should be able to do is come over to the layers, make sure everything seems to be looking correct there. Actually, I'm just going to need to jump into object mode. I'm just going to click on the little grease pencil squiggly icon there just to make sure it's selected. And come over to the layers, set the blend mode to add, and we can drop the opacity on this to taste. And now we can finally come over to the effects, but actually first let's just remove this noise modifier. We don't need that. So come on over to the effects though. The wave and the glow will keep, but now we can add the blur without this getting in the way of affecting any of the other elements. So I'm going to turn this up quite a bit, somewhere around there. Here's where I think we just need to do some general polish. So I'm going to turn off the overlays again, scan through and see what we've got. So already I can actually see the hotspot and the beam. So that's going to be something we're going to need to fix. We're only really going to want to see that come on around here and then turn it back off again. From the original effect, I'm going to turn on the UFO and the beam of light will keep. But we're going to turn off the visibility and renderability of everything else. In fact, let's come over to our filters. I want to get access to this one as well so that we can tell this not to show in the viewport. In fact, let's just bring this down a little bit, open up this, and we're going to want to do that to pretty much all of these other things. So I'm going to click and drag down across all of these. Same with this last one. And let's take a look. So we can see the blue light that comes on and kind of dazzles everything. We can't see our beam very well. So I'm going to see if we can affect this a little bit better by coming over to the material, finding our beam and opening up the settings there, coming over to the alpha channel and increasing that and seeing if we get anything. All right, I think that's okay for us. I think we want the beam on where the light is on, sort of full blast around there. And that's these two objects, the UFO beam and the hotspot. So with both of those selected, let's press I and set a keyframe for the scale. Go back a few frames to about there and then scale them right down like this, about there. So I'm just going to round this off to make it easier. So I'm going to type in 0.1, press enter, then press I to insert a scale there. So now things should come onto screen. That should come out, pick up the car around there, need to shrink again. So I'm going to press I to insert scale, go forwards a little bit and shrink it right down to 0.1 again. Inserting with the I key another scale keyframe. So let's take a look. Cool. The cow never suspected a thing.